I got divorced and moved overseas to find some peace. My ex-wife right away got engaged to a new guy. My own son told me he was going to be the best man at their wedding. Then he added that this new guy was a good, wealthy man, not like me. During the wedding, a guest said one single line that made my ex-wife completely lose her mind, and then she called me begging for help. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth and took your sacrifices for granted. I am Victor Harrison. I am 70 years old. I spent 40 long, grueling years of my life building a commercial real estate empire in Chicago and New York. 40 years of breathing in drywall dust on construction sites, arguing with stubborn city planners, and gambling everything I had on dilapidated properties no one else wanted to touch. I built my fortune with calloused hands, relentless determination, and a mind that never stopped calculating the odds. But right now, my hands were gripping the smooth, sun-warmed marble of my balcony railing in Tuscany, Italy. I was looking out over the Mediterranean Sea, watching the water turn a brilliant, blinding shade of gold in the late afternoon sun. The air smelled of sea salt and crushed lemons. This villa was supposed to be my ultimate sanctuary. It was my reward for a lifetime of relentless work. 2 years ago, I walked away from a 35-year marriage that had turned into an endless battleground. I handed my ex-wife Diane the keys to our $12 million Hamptons estate, along with a massive cash settlement, just to buy my silence and my freedom. I wanted absolutely no part of her endless social climbing, her desperate, pathetic need to impress the Manhattan elite, or the constant, exhausting drama that followed her like a shadow. I gave her the beautiful house I built from the ground up, packed my bags, and moved across the world to a place where no one knew my name. I thought I had finally purchased my peace. But peace, as I was about to learn, is a very fragile illusion when you leave behind people who view you as nothing more than a bottomless bank account. The phone in my pocket vibrated, buzzing angrily against my leg and shattering the quiet Italian afternoon. I pulled it out and looked at the bright screen. It was a United States number. It was Derek, my 34-year-old son. I had set up a multi-million-dollar trust fund for him, paid for his elite Ivy League education, and tried my hardest to teach him the value of a hard-earned dollar. But Derek had always been his mother's son, easily dazzled by flashy cars, expensive watches, and empty promises. I stared at the ringing phone, feeling a familiar heavy tightness in my jaw, and finally hit the answer button. I did not get a hello. I did not get a question about how my health was holding up, or how my new life in Italy was going. Derek launched straight into his agenda, his voice practically trembling with manic excitement. "Dad, you will not believe this," he said, not even bothering to catch his breath. "Mom is getting married. Next week. At the estate in Aspen. It is going to be the absolute event of the season, and I am going to be the best man." I stood there listening to the faint sound of seagulls crying in the distance. I took a slow, deliberate breath, keeping my emotions locked down tight. "Well, congratulations to your mother," I said, keeping my voice completely neutral and steady. "I hope she is happy with her new life. Oh, she is beyond happy." Derek rushed on his tone, shifting rapidly into something deeply arrogant, something dripping with pure condescension. "His name is Preston. He is a Wall Street hedge fund billionaire. Dad, the guy is absolutely incredible. He manages international portfolios you could not even dream of. He is a true visionary, a truly wealthy man, not a dinosaur like you. He actually understands how the modern global economy works. He does not just flip old brick buildings and deal with dirty contractors." I tightened my grip on the marble railing until my knuckles turned stark white. The stone was warm against my skin, but the blood in my veins ran ice cold. A dinosaur. That is exactly what my only son thought of the man who had funded his entire privileged, pampered existence. The man who had stayed up countless nights reviewing stressful contracts so Derek could attend exclusive prep schools and drive European sports cars on the weekends. I swallowed the bitter, acidic taste of betrayal and kept my voice perfectly steady. I am very glad you admire him so much, Derek. It sounds like you and your mother have finally found the high society life you always desperately wanted. I was ready to hang up the phone right there. I was ready to block his number permanently, pour myself a large glass of heavy red wine, and watch the Italian sunset in peace. But Derek was not finished. The arrogant bragging was just the warm-up routine. The real reason for the unexpected call was lurking right beneath the surface, exactly as my instincts had warned me. Listen. Dad. Derek said, his voice dropping an octave, desperately trying to sound like a serious, seasoned businessman. Preston is actually bringing me into his firm. He is going to make me a vice president of acquisitions. It is a massive once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. I am going to be working directly with elite international investors. That is quite a big title for someone who has never worked a single day in high finance, I pointed out smoothly, letting a hint of sarcasm bleed into my words. What exactly does a vice president of acquisitions do for a billionaire hedge fund? Derek scoffed loudly, clearly annoyed by my lack of blind enthusiasm. I am handling capital alignment and strategic client onboarding, he said, reciting the corporate buzzwords perfectly, as if he had just memorized them from a glossy marketing brochure. But here's the thing. To finalize my executive partnership, I need to make a capital contribution. A buy-in to show I have real skin in the game. Preston is giving me an incredible exclusive discount on the partner shares. I closed my eyes. The jagged pieces of the puzzle were falling into place with sickening speed. And how much is this incredibly discounted buy-in? I asked, my tone dropping to a whisper. $2 million, Derek said casually, as if he were asking me to spot him $20 for a quick lunch. I need you to authorize the absolute release of my trust fund. Just sign the digital waiver today, and the bank will wire the funds directly to Preston's corporate holding account. It is just a basic formality, really. A sudden sharp instinct flared violently in the back of my mind. It was the gut feeling of an old battle-scarred predator sensing a hidden trap in the tall brush. I had survived and thrived in the cutthroat world of commercial real estate by smelling a scam from a mile away. A supposed Wall Street billionaire, a man who allegedly managed billions of dollars in global assets, was suddenly demanding $2 million in raw cash from his new, inexperienced stepson just days before marrying the boy's wealthy mother. It made absolutely no logical sense. Real billionaires do not need a 34-year-old kid's trust fund to pad their corporate accounts. Derek, I said slowly, choosing my words with absolute surgical precision. You are asking me to liquidate the entirety of your legally protected trust fund and wire it to a man I have never even met for a job title you have absolutely no qualifications for. Dad, do not start with your outdated, pathetic lectures. Derek snapped, his voice rising in petulant anger. You do not understand how venture capital works. This is how the real elite operate. You have to spend money to make big money. Preston is doing me a huge, massive favor by even letting me invest my money with him. You are just jealous because he operates on a high level you never reached. Just sign the paper, Dad. It is my money anyway. The sheer, breathtaking audacity of his words hung heavily in the air between us. He was right about one technical thing. It was his trust fund. But I was the primary financial trustee. I held the keys to the vault. I could have yelled. I could have tried to patiently explain the massive, glaring red flags waving right in front of his face. But an old wolf does not bark before it bites. All right, Derek, I said, my voice completely devoid of any emotion. If this is truly the opportunity of a lifetime, I will not stand in your way. But I do not sign multi-million-dollar financial release forms over the phone. I will fly to New York tomorrow morning. I want to meet this visionary billionaire face to face. Set up a dinner. Derek exhaled sharply, clearly irritated by the unexpected delay, but he knew he had no other choice if he wanted the cash. Fine. We will meet you in Manhattan. But do not embarrass us, Dad. Preston is a very busy man. I hung up the phone and looked back out at the vast ocean. The quiet peace of my retirement was officially over. My son had called me a dinosaur. My ex-wife thought she had found a bigger, better bank. They wanted me to just roll over, sign the heavy check, and disappear back into obscurity. But they had foolishly forgotten exactly who they were dealing with. I walked back inside my quiet villa, opened my laptop, and booked a first-class ticket to New York. If they truly wanted a dinosaur, I was going to show them exactly how big and sharp my teeth really were. I landed at JFK before noon. I navigated the bustling airport terminal, ignoring the familiar rush of the city I had abandoned 2 years ago, to find some peace in Italy. I texted Derek the name of a restaurant in Midtown and told him to meet me there at 8. If they wanted my money, they would come to my territory. I wore a tailored suit but left off the flashy watch to look like the tired old man they expected. Let them underestimate me. That was my advantage. Diane and Preston were already seated at a secluded booth sipping champagne. Derek was absent, which told me everything. This was not about my son's career. This was an extraction operation. Victor, Diane purred, extending a hand so the light caught her massive diamond ring. "You look well. Retirement must be relaxing." I took my seat. Preston stood up, flashing whitened veneers. He offered a soft hand that had never swung a hammer. He wore a tailored suit and cufflinks that screamed for attention. Every inch of him was calculated to project immense wealth. "Victor, it is an honor," Preston said with forced warmth. "Derek told me about you. Building a regional real estate portfolio requires grit." The condescension was layered perfectly into the word regional. He was establishing himself as the global player while painting me as a small-town hustler. "It kept a roof over our heads," I replied. "But I am not here to talk about my past. I am here to talk about my son's future. $2 million is a significant amount of capital. I want to understand exactly what I am financing." Preston chuckled smoothly. "Of course you do. I respect your caution. The traditional real estate market operates on tangible, slow-moving metrics. You buy a building, you renovate it, you collect rent. It is steady but archaic. Hedge funds operate on a completely different paradigm. We deal in high-frequency algorithmic trading, global asset reallocation, and leveraged buyouts." He paused, making sure I absorbed the heavy jargon. "Derek is brilliant, but he lacks skin in the game. In my world, a vice president needs to demonstrate personal financial commitment before handling multi-billion-dollar portfolios for institutional clients. The $2 million is not a fee. It is a capital alignment procedure." "A capital alignment procedure," I repeated slowly. "Exactly." Preston nodded. "The funds are placed into an escrow account. It guarantees his equity stake. It proves to our board of directors that he is fully vested in our market strategies. It is a standard requirement for executive onboarding. You are simply fronting his entry ticket into a circle most people cannot even buy their way into." Diane leaned forward. "Victor, you have to understand. Preston manages sovereign wealth funds. He deals with foreign royals and tech billionaires. He does not need Derek's money. He is doing this as a personal favor to me, to ensure my son has a legacy that actually means something in the modern world. You should be thanking him." I looked at Diane. She was completely sold, desperate to be the wife of a Wall Street titan. I looked back at Preston. His pitch was flawless. It was perfectly designed to make a conservative businessman feel small, uneducated, and pressured to comply just to save face. He spoke with the rhythm of a con artist. "And if I refuse," I asked quietly. Preston's smile tightened. "Then Derek loses the position. The board will offer the equity stake to someone else by Friday. It would be a tragedy for him to miss out on generating generational wealth simply because you are afraid of modern financial instruments." I played my part perfectly. I let my shoulders slump, acting like a father who had been backed into a corner by a superior intellect. "I see," I said softly. "I suppose the world has moved past bricks and mortar." I watched their expressions closely, playing the role of a cautious but completely oblivious senior citizen who was just trying to follow standard banking protocols. I will need my legal team to review the documents, of course. Standard compliance. It takes them about 7 days to clear a transfer of this size from the trust. For a split second, the air went dead. Diane's smug smile vanished. Preston's jaw clenched. 7 days, Preston asked, his voice losing a fraction of its smooth polish. Victor, the board requires the capital alignment by Thursday. 7 days might compromise his equity position. It is the bank's policy for overseas trustees, I lied effortlessly. There is nothing I can do to speed it up. If your board cannot wait a few extra days for a guaranteed $2 million. Perhaps the position is not as secure as you claim. Preston recovered quickly, forcing a smile. No, I can make a call and get an extension. I want what is best for Derek. We will make it work. The waiter approached discreetly, placing the leather checkbook on the table. The bill for the champagne, the caviar, and the imported Wagyu beef came to just over $2,000. Allow me, Preston said grandly, pulling a sleek black credit card from his designer wallet and handing it to the waiter without even glancing at the total. We sat in silence for a few minutes. Diane chattered endlessly about her upcoming wedding plans in Aspen, detailing the ice sculptures and the celebrity guest list. I just nodded, watching the waiter walk back toward our table. The young man looked incredibly uncomfortable. "Excuse me, sir," the waiter whispered, leaning down close to Preston. "I am so sorry, but your card was declined. Would you like me to try another one?" Preston froze. The charismatic billionaire hedge fund manager went entirely rigid. I watched his eyes. In that fraction of a second, before the mask slipped back into place, I saw it. Pure, desperate panic. It was the look of a drowning man, realizing his lungs were finally empty. Ah, fraud protection. Preston laughed loudly, though the sound was hollow and sharp. My bank is notoriously aggressive when I travel. Here, use this one. He quickly produced a different card, his hands moving with frantic speed. The waiter took it and hurried away. Diane looked momentarily annoyed but quickly brushed it off, accustomed to his excuses. But I did not brush it off. I sat back in my chair, the cold, heavy realization settling deeply into my bones. The watch was custom to hide a fake dial. The financial jargon was rehearsed nonsense, and the supposedly limitless black card had just bounced on a $2,000 dinner. The man demanding my son's trust fund was not a billionaire. I knew instantly that this was a massive, dangerous scam designed to siphon away my family's wealth before the wedding. Preston was absolutely nothing more than a cheap, desperate con artist hiding behind expensive cologne and empty corporate buzzwords. I would tear his fake empire down to the ground, brick by brick, and completely destroy him. The hunt had officially begun. The waiter returned with a forced smile, handing Preston the sleek leather folio with a slight bow. Preston took the receipt, scribbled his signature with a heavy gold pen, and slid it back across the table with a practiced flick of his wrist. He looked at Diane, his charm instantly snapping back into place like a well-oiled machine. She beamed at him, her eyes completely blind to the terrifying red flags waving furiously right in front of her face. I kept my expression entirely neutral, sipping my sparkling water with the calm detachment of a man who had spent 40 years sitting across the negotiation table from some of the most ruthless predators in the world. I was a man who built an empire from dust and concrete. I knew how real money behaved. Real money is quiet. Real money does not need to announce itself loudly in crowded restaurants, and real money certainly does not sweat when a single credit card gets declined. I let the silence stretch for a long moment, allowing Preston to believe he had successfully navigated the awkwardness of the declined transaction. My son finally broke the silence, clearing his throat and leaning forward with an eager, almost desperate look in his eyes. "So, Dad," Derek started, drumming his fingers nervously against the fine linen tablecloth. "Are we good to go on the trust release? The paperwork is pretty straightforward. You just need to digitally sign the authorization, and my broker can handle the transfer by tomorrow morning." I did not answer right away. Instead, I leaned back in my chair and turned my full attention to the man sitting next to my ex-wife. Preston was currently resting his left arm on the table, adjusting his shirt cuff to make sure his watch caught the ambient light of the restaurant. It was a Patek Philippe, a piece that supposedly retailed for a small fortune. But my eyes were trained to catch details that ordinary people missed. The bezel was too thick, and the casing lacked the subtle, flawless finish of a genuine Swiss masterpiece. It was a custom-build, a high-end replica designed to fool the untrained eye. Hustlers wore custom builds because they needed the illusion of immense wealth to gain the trust of their victims. "That is a fascinating timepiece, Preston," I said, keeping my voice mild and conversational. A man who appreciates fine watches usually appreciates solid, transparent investments. "Tell me a little more about this hedge fund of yours. What exactly is your primary strategy for generating these massive returns for your exclusive clients?" Preston puffed out his chest, clearly thrilled to be given an opportunity to boast about his supposed financial genius. He launched into a long, convoluted monologue about leveraging macroeconomic trends and utilizing proprietary algorithms to outsmart the traditional markets. It was a textbook sales pitch completely devoid of any real substance, designed to dazzle fools and separate them from their cash. "We are currently positioning ourselves for a massive liquidity event," Preston declared confidently, taking a slow sip of his expensive wine. "We utilize a highly aggressive Regulation D strategy to bypass standard equity restrictions. It allows us to completely ignore the usual compliance hurdles and fast-track our capital deployment. The SEC essentially gives us a blank check to move assets across borders without the typical regulatory friction." I felt a cold, sharp spike of absolute certainty hit the center of my chest. Any first-year finance student knew that Regulation D was merely a safe harbor exemption for private placements. It had absolutely nothing to do with bypassing compliance hurdles, and the SEC certainly never handed out blank checks to anyone. Preston was casually throwing around impressive-sounding regulatory terms, completely unaware that he was using them incorrectly. He was fundamentally financially illiterate. He was playing a dangerous role, and my own son was sitting there nodding along like a brainwashed disciple. Derek looked at me with a mixture of pity and superiority, completely captivated by the man who was actively planning to steal his entire future. "You see, Dad," Derek chimed in, his voice dripping with condescension, "the modern market moves at lightning speed. You cannot rely on old-school property appraisals and slow bank loans anymore. Preston operates on a global scale. He is offering me a seat at a table that most people never even get to see. This is my chance to build real, sustainable wealth. I am going to be a major player in the international market, and all I need is for you to simply sign that one piece of paper." I looked at my son, feeling a profound sense of sadness beneath my burning anger. I had tried so hard to teach him the value of hard work, to show him that true success requires patience, discipline, and a strong moral compass. But Diane had poisoned his mind, filling his head with delusions of grandeur and a toxic sense of entitlement. He truly believed he deserved to be handed a multi-million-dollar executive position without putting in a single day of actual effort. He was the perfect naive mark for a seasoned predator like Preston. I let out a very slow, deep breath, steepling my fingers together on the table. "You have certainly made a passionate case, Derek," I said quietly, making sure my tone sounded thoroughly defeated. "I may not understand all the complex intricacies of global hedge funds and offshore capital deployment, but I do understand that you are a grown man. If you are entirely certain that this is the right path for your future, I will not stand in your way. I will sign the release authorization for your trust fund." Derek's face lit up with overwhelming relief and absolute triumph. Diane smiled brightly, her eyes gleaming with the greedy satisfaction of a woman who believed she had just won the ultimate victory. Preston nodded approvingly, raising his glass in a silent toast to his own deceptive brilliance. However, I added smoothly, raising a single finger to pause their premature celebration. "As the primary trustee, I am legally bound by the strict protocols established by my wealth management firm. They enforce a mandatory 7-day holding period on any capital transfer exceeding $1 million. It is a standard anti-fraud compliance measure designed to protect large assets. I will sign the paperwork tonight, but the funds will not physically clear the escrow account for exactly 1 week. The temperature at the table dropped instantly. Diane's smug smile vanished entirely, replaced by a sudden, jarring expression of sheer, unadulterated terror. Her manicured hand trembled visibly as she set her expensive champagne glass down. Preston's charismatic facade cracked wide open, his jaw clenching so hard the muscles jumped beneath his skin. He stared at me, his eyes wide with a frantic, desperate panic that he could absolutely no longer hide from me. My powerful, sharp-honed gut feeling had been completely and undeniably right all along. Why in the world would a highly successful, allegedly brilliant Wall Street billionaire ever panic over a mere week's wait for exactly $2 million? I let the question hang in the heavy air of the restaurant for a fraction of a second before I smoothed away any trace of suspicion from my face. I did not demand answers. I did not throw accusations across the table or cause a scene. Decades in the brutal commercial real estate trenches had taught me a valuable lesson. When you spot a dangerous rat in your building, you do not stomp your feet and scare it deep into the walls. You quietly buy the strongest rat poison available and tightly lock all the doors. I sighed heavily, letting my shoulders slump forward perfectly, playing the role of the exhausted, overly cautious old man who simply could not keep up with the fast-paced modern financial world. I told Preston I would have my lawyers expedite the massive paperwork as much as legally possible, but that the strict bank compliance was completely out of my hands. Derek rolled his eyes, muttering something highly disrespectful under his breath about bureaucratic dinosaurs holding up progress, while Diane quickly patted Preston on the arm to soothe his clearly frayed nerves. I stood up from the table, politely declined their half-hearted offer to share a luxury town car, and calmly walked out into the cool Manhattan night. I walked silently for several long blocks, letting the crisp air clear my mind. They thought they had won. They thought they had successfully manipulated the tired old man into handing over the keys to the kingdom. I did not go back to my original hotel to sleep. I securely checked into a private corner suite at a highly discreet luxury hotel in Midtown, a place known for thick, soundproof walls and heavy blackout curtains. The room was dimly lit, illuminated only by the amber glow of the streetlights filtering through the sheer drapes. I poured myself a single neat glass of bourbon, sat down in the heavy leather armchair in the corner, and pulled out my mobile phone. I bypassed my regular legal team and dialed a highly private number I had not called since the chaotic day my divorce was officially finalized. It belonged to Mitchell. Mitchell was my former chief financial officer, but that corporate title barely scratched the surface of what he actually did for my company. He was a ruthless, brilliant financial forensic expert, a man who could easily track a single hidden dollar through a massive maze of offshore accounts in his sleep. Years ago, when rival developers attempted hostile takeovers, Mitchell was the silent hammer I used to completely shatter their foundations. He answered on the second ring, his voice sharp and alert, despite the incredibly late hour. I told him I needed him at my hotel suite immediately, and that he needed to bring his secured laptops. Mitchell arrived exactly 35 minutes later, wearing a dark, tailored suit and carrying a heavy metal briefcase. He did not ask how my relaxing flight from Italy was, and I did not offer any polite pleasantries. I handed him a folded slip of paper with Preston's full name, the exact name of his supposed hedge fund, and the specific details of the custom watch I had spotted at dinner. I told Mitchell exactly what I had witnessed. The fake luxury timepiece, the incorrectly used financial terminology, the declined black card, and the sheer, unadulterated panic over a simple 7-day delay for a $2 million wire transfer. I did not ask Mitchell to run a standard basic background check. I looked my trusted old friend dead in the eye and ordered him to ruthlessly tear Preston's entire existence down to the structural studs. I wanted to know where he bought his groceries, who officially held the lease on his luxury vehicles, and exactly how much massive debt he was currently hiding behind those blindingly white veneers. He had picked the wrong man to con. Mitchell simply nodded, opened his heavy briefcase, powered up his encrypted network system, and went straight to work. The hunt was officially on. Over the next 3 grueling days, I played my part flawlessly. I needed to keep Preston completely comfortable, entirely convinced that his massive $2 million payday was safely making its way through the slow, archaic banking system. I rented expensive clubs and spent my mornings playing terribly bad rounds of golf at an exclusive country club on Long Island. I purposely missed easy putts and complained loudly about my bad back to anyone listening, reinforcing the pathetic image of a washed-up retiree. Diane texted me constantly, sending me glossy photos of the massive floral arrangements she was currently ordering for the upcoming lavish wedding in Aspen, completely unaware that she was eagerly planning her own absolute destruction. She included little passive-aggressive notes, constantly reminding me how incredibly generous Preston was being to Derek, and how lucky we all were that he was willing to elevate our son to his elite level of society. Derek called me twice, not to say thank you, but to complain about the banking delay and loudly boast about the tailored Italian suits he was happily buying on Preston's corporate account for the wedding party. I smiled into the phone. I agreed with every single arrogant word they said. I swallowed my pride and let them gloat, feeding them enough rope to hang themselves comfortably. They were so incredibly blinded by their own extreme greed and their desperate need for high society validation that they never once stopped to look over their shoulders. While they foolishly picked out expensive champagne and laughed loudly at my expense, Mitchell sat locked in that dimly lit hotel suite, relentlessly digging through the deep digital dirt. He barely slept, subsisting on black coffee and sheer determination. On the quiet evening of the 4th day, I returned to the cold suite after another tedious afternoon of pretending to play golf. Mitchell was staring intently at his glowing monitors, the bright blue light reflecting off his thick glasses. He did not turn around when I closed the heavy wooden door securely behind me. He just pointed a single, steady finger at the complex screen on his left. He had managed to bypass a massive digital firewall on a seemingly obscure corporate registry database. He meticulously traced the primary registration of Preston's supposedly massive Wall Street hedge fund. It was absolutely not headquartered in a gleaming glass skyscraper in Manhattan. It was a phantom shell corporation registered to a tiny, nondescript post office box in Delaware. But that was just the very beginning of the lie. Mitchell quickly tapped his keyboard, bringing up a highly restricted tax filing document he had extracted through a hidden backdoor server. He finally turned his chair and looked directly at me, his expression completely grim and utterly devoid of any humor. The first massive piece of the terrible puzzle had just dropped heavily into place. The documents told a very clear and undeniable story of complete financial deception. Preston's elite, globally recognized hedge fund had absolutely zero active institutional investors, meaning the man marrying my ex-wife was nothing but a completely broke, desperate fraud. I stared at the glowing monitor, watching the digital manifestation of a complete lie unfold right before my eyes. Zero active institutional investors. It was a phantom, a mirage built on nothing but arrogance and cheap cologne. Mitchell did not stop typing. His fingers flew across the keyboard with a steady, rhythmic intensity, peeling back the layers of Preston's carefully constructed financial masquerade. In my 40 years of navigating the cutthroat real estate markets of New York and Chicago, I had encountered every type of hustler, snake, and charlatan imaginable. But the sheer scale of the audacity required to walk into my life and demand $2 million for a completely empty shell corporation was almost impressive in its pure delusion. I poured myself another finger of bourbon, swirling the amber liquid in the heavy glass. "Find me the actual money, Mitchell," I instructed, my voice barely above a whisper. "He has to be funding this lavish lifestyle somehow. Custom watches and Michelin-star dinners do not pay for themselves. He is floating cash from somewhere, and I want to know exactly whose pockets he has been picking to finance this pathetic illusion." Mitchell nodded silently, pulling up a series of heavily encrypted European regulatory files. He bypassed a localized security block and opened a document bearing the official seal of the European Securities and Markets Authority. Preston was not just a fake billionaire. He was a documented, internationally recognized financial predator. 5 years ago, he was permanently banned from trading in the European Union following a massive investigation into unverified offshore asset management. He fled back to the United States before criminal charges could be formally filed, slipping through a jurisdictional loophole. But a parasite does not change its nature. It simply finds a new host. Mitchell traced the scattered banking routines connected to the Delaware shell. Preston was running a highly sophisticated textbook Ponzi scheme right here in Manhattan. He was bleeding dry, vulnerable, wealthy, elderly widows he met at charity galas, along with a handful of incredibly naive Silicon Valley tech developers who thought they were investing in an exclusive high-yield algorithmic fund. He used the fresh capital from new victims to pay the minimum required returns to the older ones, skimming an absolutely massive percentage off the top to fund his tailored suits, his luxury leased vehicles, and his daily facade. The sick reality of his operation painted a very clear picture of the man Diane had chosen to replace me. He was a vulture feeding on the gullible. The sudden realization hit me with the forceful impact of a physical blow to the chest. The $2 million Derek was begging me to release from his secure trust fund had absolutely nothing to do with securing a prestigious vice president position at a thriving firm. There was no executive board for him to impress. There was no international portfolio for him to manage. There was only Preston sitting in a rented office space desperately trying to plug the massive sinking holes in his fraudulent ship. Mitchell pulled up a series of flagged high-risk communications, intercepted from a secondary server hidden behind a virtual private network. Preston was drowning in toxic debt. He had borrowed heavily from aggressive, incredibly dangerous underground creditors to keep his Ponzi scheme afloat during a recent dry spell, and those particular lenders were no longer asking politely for their monthly returns. They were demanding immediate liquid cash, and they were making specific physical threats to ensure compliance. My foolish, arrogant son was not being groomed for high society greatness. He was being lined up as a convenient human shield. Preston intended to take the $2 million from Derek's trust fund and hand it directly to violent criminals to buy his own miserable life a few more weeks of breathing room. Derek had insulted me, called me a dinosaur, and aggressively demanded my money, all while walking completely blindfolded straight into a lethal financial meat grinder. My anger toward my son briefly shifted into a cold, protective instinct, but it quickly hardened back into ruthless, unwavering clarity. I would save him from the immediate physical danger, but I would absolutely not save his fragile, oversized ego from the consequences of his actions. He needed to learn this bitter, humiliating lesson in a way that would permanently scar his memory and teach him the true value of loyalty and respect. I would let the illusion stretch just a little bit longer. I walked over to the heavy blackout curtains and pulled them back just an inch, looking down at the empty, quiet street below the luxury hotel. I told Mitchell we had enough solid, undeniable evidence to quietly contact the federal authorities and drop an anonymous, highly detailed tip to the Securities and Exchange Commission. We could easily let the federal agents raid the upcoming wedding in Aspen, arrest Preston in front of his wealthy new friends, and completely humiliate Diane for her blind, superficial greed. The sheer, undeniable poetry of that specific outcome was incredibly tempting. I turned back to the center of the room, prepared to give Mitchell the final, absolute order to compile the dossier for the authorities and wash my hands of the entire miserable situation. But Mitchell did not look up from his screen to acknowledge my directive. Instead, he raised a hand signaling for absolute silence. The rhythmic clacking of his keyboard slowed down to single, deliberate, heavy keystrokes. He had found something else hiding deep within the encrypted architecture of Preston's fake corporate empire. Something that went far beyond my son's $2 million trust fund and the stolen money from the naive tech developers. "You need to see this right now," Victor Mitchell said, his voice entirely stripped of its usual clinical detachment. He manually turned his glowing monitor toward me, pushing his chair back, to give me a clear, unobstructed view of the screen. I leaned in, narrowing my eyes at the complex web of banking routing numbers and offshore destination codes displaying in stark white text against a black background. Mitchell had successfully uncovered a secondary, highly concealed wire transfer protocol set up by Preston just 3 days ago. It was an automated trigger meticulously scheduled to execute a massive, untraceable transfer of funds directly to an anonymous holding account located in Cyprus. I looked closely at the primary source of the pending transfer, fully expecting to see another one of Preston's defrauded clients, or perhaps a drained retirement account from one of his unfortunate victims. Instead, the breath was completely knocked out of my lungs, and a cold, terrifying wave of absolute fury washed over my entire body. The source account was tethered directly to a massive, newly approved home equity line of credit, and that specific line of credit was inextricably linked directly to the public deed of Diane's $12 million Hamptons estate. The home I built from nothing was about to be completely stolen by a common thief. This level of betrayal was entirely beyond anything I had ever anticipated. I quickly felt a dangerous, terrifying rage silently taking full control of my rapidly beating heart. I stared at the glowing digits on Mitchell's screen, my vision tunneling as the sheer magnitude of the theft became agonizingly clear. That house was not just a piece of real estate. I had personally laid the imported Italian tile in the foyer. I had handed that sprawling $12 million property over to Diane debt-free, a golden parachute designed solely to buy my peace of mind. And now this slick, pathetic con artist was carving it up and selling it to the highest bidder right under her nose. "Show me the signature documents," I ordered, my voice dropping to a low, gravelly timbre that caused Mitchell to flinch. I needed to see exactly how Preston had managed to bypass the rigorous bank security protocols to leverage a property that did not legally belong to him. Mitchell rapidly tapped his keyboard, navigating through an encrypted server portal he had compromised, and pulled up a digitized copy of the final loan authorization. There it was displayed in stark black and white. Preston had not forged a single document. He had not hacked into Diane's personal accounts or stolen her identity to secure the massive line of credit. The elegant looping signature sitting at the bottom of the catastrophic financial contract belonged entirely to my ex-wife. She had willingly signed her own financial death warrant. I read through the dense legal clauses, my disgust multiplying with every single sentence. Preston had clearly pitched this to her as a temporary, highly exclusive financial maneuver designed to secure early allocations in a lucrative international investment. He had leveraged her insatiable hunger for social status to convince her to gamble the only real asset she possessed. But the loan was not originated by any legitimate, federally insured financial institution. "Mitchell," I said, pointing a rigid finger at the official letterhead of the lending entity. "Run a trace on this underwriting firm." Mitchell ran the query, and the results populated on the screen in seconds. The firm was a notorious, highly aggressive shell company operated by an underground lending syndicate. They were loan sharks dressed in tailored suits, a ruthless organization known for charging criminally extortionate interest rates and using deeply terrifying, violent methods to collect on defaulted debts. Preston had essentially handed a map to a cartel and told them exactly where my ex-wife slept at night. "He borrowed $5 million from a shadow syndicate," Mitchell stated quietly, pushing his glasses up the bridge of his nose. "And according to this digital ledger, the loan funds were deposited directly into a joint holding account 3 days ago. But the money is already queued for an automated exit. Preston has a delayed wire transfer established to sweep the entire $5 million into the anonymous offshore Cyprus account at exactly 9 o'clock on Saturday night. The exact night of their lavish 500-guest wedding reception in Aspen. The sick, twisted brilliance of Preston's exit strategy suddenly became crystal clear. He was never going to say, 'I do.' He was never going to stand at that altar and promise to love my incredibly gullible ex-wife. He was using the extravagant wedding as the ultimate distraction. While Diane was posing for photographs in her designer gown and bragging to her socialite friends, Preston was going to be quietly slipping out the back door with $5 million of her stolen equity. And he is not just taking the $5 million, I realized aloud, the pieces of the puzzle snapping together with terrifying precision. He is taking my son's trust fund with him. Mitchell nodded grimly, highlighting another pending transaction on the dark screen. Yes. The automated protocol is set to sweep multiple accounts simultaneously. The $5 million from the home equity loan, plus the $2 million you are supposed to wire from Derek's trust fund tomorrow morning. $7 million in total, all funneling directly into a completely untouchable offshore haven in Cyprus, before bouncing through a dozen international proxy servers. I felt a sickening hollow drop in the pit of my stomach. My anger toward Derek had been fierce, but he was still my blood. Preston was not just planning to steal Derek's inheritance. By tricking Derek into wiring $2 million directly into a holding account that was currently commingling funds with a violent underground syndicate, Preston was deliberately making my son an active participant in a massive federal crime. If that scheduled wire transfer went through Derek's name, would be permanently tied to the syndicate's laundered money. When the authorities eventually caught wind of the financial collapse, Preston would be long gone, sunning himself on a private beach. My son, however, would be left standing here holding the deeply incriminating bag. Derek would be the designated fall guy. He would be the one facing decades in a federal penitentiary for wire fraud conspiracy and international money laundering, all because he was too desperate to play the role of a Wall Street titan. Find me his physical exit strategy, I commanded, stepping away from the heavy blackout curtains and pacing the length of the hotel suite. A man who steals $7 million from a dangerous criminal syndicate and leaves his bride stranded does not stick around to enjoy the wedding cake. He has a flight booked. Find it. Mitchell's fingers flew across the illuminated keys, running a sophisticated scrape on international travel manifests and private charter registries. The quiet hotel room felt suffocatingly tense. I paced back and forth, calculating the exact amount of force required to completely obliterate Preston, without allowing the collateral damage to permanently destroy my son's future. Got it! Mitchell finally announced, his voice tight with adrenaline. He did not book a commercial flight. He secured a seat on a private, untraceable charter leaving out of a small regional airstrip located just 30 miles outside of Aspen. Give me the exact departure time, I demanded, stepping up right behind his leather chair and staring intently at the glowing travel manifest. The private charter is scheduled for wheels up at exactly 11 o'clock on Saturday night, Mitchell said, turning to look up at me. The final destination is Dubai. He has a secondary connection booked to a private island in the Maldives. Once he is on that plane, the money is gone forever, and the federal authorities will have absolutely no one left to target but your son. I slowly checked the heavy gold watch strapped to my left wrist. It was currently Thursday evening. The extravagant rehearsal dinner was scheduled for tomorrow night, and the wedding itself was taking place the day after. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling the cold, predatory calm completely taking over my mind and my tired body. Preston thought he was a mastermind. He believed he had successfully played an outdated, foolish old man. He had absolutely no idea that he had just invited a seasoned, utterly ruthless apex predator directly into his fragile house of cards. I had exactly 48 hours left to stop my naive, arrogant son from becoming an unwitting accessory to massive federal fraud and entirely destroying his own pathetic life. I forced myself to take a slow, deep breath, pushing the blinding rage down into a cold, tightly contained box deep inside my chest. Panicking was for amateurs, and I was a seasoned veteran of corporate warfare. Mitchell watched me closely, his hands hovering over the illuminated keyboard, waiting for the inevitable command to contact the federal authorities. He expected me to call the police, to send agents rushing into the hotel to arrest the fraudulent hedge fund manager before the private charter plane could leave the runway. But I shook my head slowly, staring at the damning financial documents. The authorities were far too slow, bogged down by endless red tape. By the time a federal judge properly reviewed the complex evidence and signed a valid arrest warrant, Preston would already be halfway across the Atlantic Ocean. We needed a significantly faster, entirely lethal approach that bypassed the standard legal system completely. I needed a weapon that I controlled directly. Mitchell, I said, my voice dangerously calm and incredibly steady in the quiet hotel suite. Do not call the authorities just yet. Instead, I need you to access my personal, heavily encrypted digital archive. Dig past the current corporate holdings and pull up the deeply buried files containing the final unredacted decrees of my divorce settlement with Diane. Mitchell raised a single eyebrow in mild surprise, but immediately went to work. I walked over to the small wet bar and poured myself another measure of dark bourbon, letting the burning liquid clear my thoughts. I explained the history as Mitchell navigated the complex security protocols. When Diane and I officially separated, she fought tooth and nail for absolute ownership of the sprawling Hamptons estate. It was her ultimate prize, a towering monument to her superficial social status. I had willingly let her have the physical property. I only cared about maintaining leverage. I detailed the quiet, ironclad trap I had deliberately laid years ago, long before a cheap con artist like Preston had ever entered her shallow orbit. During our marriage, there was a specific, significant joint tax liability associated with a massive architectural renovation of that coastal estate, amounting to exactly $200,000. During the final divorce negotiations, I legally attached a silent but incredibly powerful tax lien to the property deed. The strict legal language explicitly stipulated that the title of the massive estate could not be cleanly transferred, sold, or leveraged in any financial capacity until she officially settled that specific debt directly with my primary holding company. It was a standard protective measure, legally binding and filed deep within the local county property records. I knew Diane better than she knew herself. I knew she despised dealing with mundane financial paperwork, and I knew her arrogant nature would be her ultimate undoing. Mitchell accessed the secure municipal database, expertly pulling up the official property records for the Hamptons estate. I stood behind his leather chair, watching the screen intently. I already knew exactly what he would find. Diane, utterly blinded by her own extreme sense of entitlement and complete financial incompetence, had entirely ignored the outstanding debt. She automatically assumed that simply because our divorce was finalized and I was out of her daily life, the lingering paper trail did not matter anymore. She never paid the $200,000 to my holding company. She had spent the last several years hosting lavish summer parties, completely oblivious to the fact that a quiet financial time bomb was still firmly attached to the very foundation of her beloved home. Mitchell opened the final county ledger, and the bright screen confirmed my absolute certainty. The silent tax lien was active, unresolved, and firmly binding. A slow, genuinely predatory smile began to spread across Mitchell's normally stoic face as he fully realized the catastrophic magnitude of what this single piece of paper actually meant. Because that specific senior tax lien was never properly resolved, Diane never actually possessed a clear, unencumbered legal title to the massive Hamptons estate. Her ownership was fundamentally restricted. Therefore, when she eagerly signed her name to Preston's $5 million shadow loan offering the coastal property as the primary collateral, her signature was practically and completely legally invalid. She had enthusiastically pledged an asset that she did not fully hold the rights to pledge. Preston had meticulously manipulated her into signing a deeply fraudulent document, but because of my hidden trap, the underlying collateral agreement was nothing more than a worthless stack of useless paper. The entire $5 million transaction was built on a fractured, voidable foundation. I explained the severe ramifications to Mitchell, though his brilliant financial mind was already racing miles ahead of my words. By willingly signing a massive multi-million-dollar collateral agreement against a heavily encumbered property, without ever legally disclosing the existing senior lien, Diane had officially committed a monumental act of deliberate bank fraud. She had effectively and legally defrauded an extremely dangerous underground lending syndicate. Preston thought he was a masterful puppet master, using my naive ex-wife to steal $5 million from ruthless criminals so he could abscond to Dubai in absolute luxury. But his brilliant escape plan was deeply flawed. The ruthless syndicate enforcers would eventually look closely at the underlying paperwork and instantly realize that the valuable collateral they thought they held was legally voidable. The massive shadow loan was entirely unsecured. The money Preston thought he had safely secured was legally frozen. I stood in the center of the quiet hotel room, holding the ultimate detonator to their entire operation firmly in my hands. I was no longer merely going to stop Preston from stealing my son's $2 million trust fund. That was now just a minor detail in a grander strategy. I was going to completely trap Preston in the United States with $5 million of incredibly dangerous, furious syndicate debt hanging tightly around his neck like a heavy concrete block. He would have absolutely nowhere to run, no money to fund his private charter, and absolutely no protection from the angry lenders he had just foolishly swindled. Furthermore, I was going to let Diane face the devastating, deeply humiliating legal consequences of her own blinding greed. She had signed those fraudulent papers willingly, eager to cement her elite status, and she would finally pay the ultimate price. I turned back to the glowing screens, my mind locked onto the sequence of events that needed to happen next. "Mitchell," I said, my tone resonating with absolute finality, "I want you to immediately draft the legal documents to enforce the tax lien and initiate a massive asset freeze injunction on the Hamptons estate. I also want you to prepare an anonymous tip outlining the exact structure of Preston's Ponzi scheme, including all the offshore routing numbers and his defrauded clients. We are not going to send anything to the authorities tonight. We will let them sleep peacefully. We will let them wake up, put on their designer clothes, and smile brightly for all the cameras. We will calmly hold our fire until the absolutely perfect moment. We will drop the bomb right at the altar." The flight to Colorado was a quiet, solitary affair. I spent the entire journey meticulously reviewing Mitchell's legal drafts and solidifying my absolute resolve. Aspen in the winter was a breathtaking playground for the excessively wealthy, a place where people went to see and be seen by high society. The extravagant rehearsal dinner was being held at an exclusive, heavily guarded lodge nestled halfway up the snow-covered mountain. It was a breathtaking venue that commanded a terrifying price tag for a single evening. I arrived exactly on time, stepping out of a standard, inconspicuous taxicab rather than a chauffeured town car. I made absolutely sure my worn brown leather shoes hit the pristine cobblestone driveway with a heavy, tired thud. I was wearing a respectable but distinctly dated gray suit, the exact kind of garment you would expect to find in the dusty closet of a man who had completely surrendered his ambition to the quiet comfort of retirement. The lodge interior was aggressively lavish and opulent. Vaulted ceilings constructed from imported timber soared high above a massive room decorated with thousands of imported white orchids. Waiters in crisp tuxedos circulated smoothly with silver trays bearing beluga caviar and vintage champagne. It was a staggering, sickening display of financial hemorrhage funded entirely by stolen money and a rapidly ticking time bomb of violent syndicate debt. I navigated the crowded, glittering room, blending seamlessly into the background like a faded piece of antique furniture. Diane was holding court near a massive, roaring stone fireplace, absolutely radiating a toxic, manufactured superiority. She wore a stunning emerald green designer gown that caught every flicker of the ambient light, and a heavy diamond necklace that practically screamed for immediate attention. She was laughing loudly, throwing her head back and lightly touching another guest's arm. Diane was flawlessly playing the ultimate role of the billionaire hedge fund managers, beautiful bride eagerly soaking up the envy and admiration of her shallow social circle. She was entirely blind to the invisible lethal noose tightening around her neck. Preston stood proudly beside her, flashing his artificially whitened veneers and casually holding a crystal tumbler of expensive scotch. He looked the part, perfectly expertly mingling with the wealthy guests, exchanging meaningless corporate pleasantries and projecting an aura of absolute invincibility. But from my quiet, shadowed vantage point, I could see the subtle, telltale signs of immense, crushing stress. There was a slight, undeniable tremor in his left hand every single time he slowly raised his crystal glass. I noticed the rigid, forced posture of his tense shoulders. I saw the desperate way his eyes constantly darted toward the main exit, frantically scanning the beautiful room for dangerous threats that only he knew existed. He was a cornered rat, desperately trying to maintain the grand illusion of a fearless lion. Before I could find a quiet corner to observe the tragic comedy unfolding before me, a firm, aggressive hand suddenly grabbed my right shoulder with surprising, unprovoked force. I turned around slowly to find my son Derek glaring at me with an expression of profound irritation and barely concealed disgust. He was wearing a custom-tailored midnight blue tuxedo, a perfectly tied silk bow tie, and a pair of imported velvet loafers that probably cost more than my very first car. He quickly pulled me away from the main crowd, forcefully dragging me toward a dimly lit alcove near the swinging kitchen service doors. "What are you doing here looking exactly like that?" Derek hissed, his voice dropping to a harsh, venomous, incredibly disrespectful, and angry whisper. He looked me up and down, his eyes locking onto my scuffed leather shoes with absolute, undisguised contempt. "We are hosting some of the most powerful institutional investors in the entire country tonight. Preston's elite Wall Street colleagues are standing right in that room. You look like a substitute high school teacher who accidentally wandered into the completely wrong building." I looked deeply at my son, feeling a profound, heavy sadness settling coldly into my chest. He was so completely lost in the grand illusion, so thoroughly seduced by the empty promise of sudden, unearned, and massive financial wealth. He was entirely willing to treat his own flesh and blood father like a piece of worthless, discarded garbage. I kept my face entirely neutral, letting my shoulders slump forward in a pathetic posture of complete, undeniable defeat. "I am terribly sorry, Derek," I said softly, injecting a slight, pathetic quaver into my aging voice. "I absolutely did not mean to cause any undue embarrassment tonight. I just wanted to be here to warmly support you and your beautiful mother on this incredibly important weekend. I brought the absolute best formal suit I currently had available in my closet." Derek let out a heavy, dramatically exaggerated sigh, aggressively rubbing the bridge of his nose as if my mere physical presence was giving him a massive, debilitating migraine. "Look, Dad, I appreciate the sentimental thought, but you really have to deeply understand the elevated level of elite society we are currently operating in now. These powerful people judge absolutely everything. They strictly evaluate you based on your polished appearance, your exclusive connections, and your liquid capital. You are a massive walking liability to the pristine corporate image we are desperately trying to project to all these very important guests. Just go find a quiet seat at the very back of the room. Table 24 is located right near the busy service corridor. Sit there. Keep your head down. Do absolutely not try to mingle with any of the VIP guests, and for the love of God, do not bring up your pathetic regional real estate portfolio. Just eat your dinner quietly and stay completely out of our way." I swallowed the heavy, burning lump of intense disrespect, nodding very slowly, like a harshly chastised child. "Of course, son," I murmured quietly, keeping my eyes fixed downward. "I completely understand your position. I will stay entirely out of the way tonight." Derek turned quickly on his heel and marched confidently back into the glittering crowd, seamlessly transitioning back into the charming, sophisticated heir apparent. I walked slowly toward the back of the massive dining room, carefully navigating the complex labyrinth of elegantly draped tables until I finally found table 24. It was strategically hidden behind a massive floral arrangement right next to the swinging kitchen doors. I took my seat, completely isolated from the loud laughter and the continuous clinking glasses of the main event. I watched the entire room from my shadowed, quiet sanctuary. I watched Diane happily raise a glass to warmly toast her brilliant, wealthy fiancé. I watched Derek eagerly mingle with the fake executives, eagerly shaking hands and trying to secure his entirely fictional future. I watched Preston nervously check his counterfeit watch, silently counting down the fleeting hours, until his scheduled cowardly escape to Dubai. They were all dancing blindly on the absolute edge of a sheer cliff. I reached a steady hand into my pocket. Under the table, completely out of sight, I sent a single definitive and absolutely devastating one-word text to Mitchell. Execute. The early morning sun rose over the sprawling Hamptons estate, casting a brilliant golden light across the meticulously manicured lawns. It was the absolute picture of high society perfection, a breathtaking venue completely transformed into a vulgar display of stolen wealth. Massive white tents had been erected overnight, housing 500 pristine mahogany chairs and tables draped in imported silk. Workers in crisp white uniforms scurried across the property, carefully arranging rare orchids and polishing towering crystal champagne pyramids. It was an astonishing spectacle of limitless greed, funded entirely by a deeply fraudulent shadow loan that was about to officially detonate. I stood quietly near the edge of the grand stone patio, a solitary figure nursing a cup of black coffee while the chaotic preparations swirled around me. Massive ice sculptures intricately carved into the shapes of soaring swans were being carefully positioned near the main entrance. Every single detail screamed of desperate extravagance. Preston had spared absolutely no expense, largely because he was not actually paying for any of it. He was gleefully burning through Diane's equity, creating a blindingly bright distraction to cover his cowardly escape. I watched the frantic caterers, feeling a cold, unwavering calm perfectly settle down. Derek strutted onto the patio, holding a flute of vintage champagne, despite the incredibly early hour. He was puffing out his chest, completely consumed by his own manufactured importance. He wore a bespoke midnight blue tuxedo that fit him with flawless precision, completely unaware that the fabric on his back had been purchased using a heavily monitored fraudulent line of credit. He walked with the heavy, arrogant swagger of a man who firmly believed he had just conquered the financial universe. He approached me with a condescending smirk, clearly eager to proudly remind me of his arrogant brand-new world. "Quite a massive step up from your usual regional block parties. Is it not?" Derek sneered, taking a slow, dramatic sip of his expensive champagne. You really have to admire the sheer scale of Preston's vision. He does not just participate in the market. He completely dictates the terms of reality. I looked at my son, feeling a sharp pang of profound sorrow beneath my simmering anger. He was so completely brainwashed, so utterly desperate for unearned validation, that he could not sight the massive financial guillotine swinging down toward his neck. I offered him a weak, quiet, submissive nod. "It is certainly an incredibly impressive display, son," I replied softly, keeping my voice mild and defeated. "You have undoubtedly aligned yourself with a man of extraordinary resources." Derek scoffed, rolling his eyes at my apparent lack of sophistication. "It is not just about the resources, Dad. It is about the global mindset. Something you could never properly understand with your outdated concrete and steel mentality. Preston operates on an entirely different evolutionary plane." I watched Derek turn and walk away, happily greeting a group of wealthy socialites, completely blind to the fact that his supposed mentor was a fraud. The morning slowly bled into the early afternoon, and the massive estate became packed with hundreds of elite guests. High-profile investment bankers, influential politicians, and wealthy heirs filled the manicured gardens, their loud laughter echoing across the pristine coastal property. They eagerly drank the stolen champagne and admired the fraudulent luxury, entirely unaware that they were participating in a massive criminal illusion. I navigated the crowded spaces, silently invisible in my conservative gray suit, a ghost haunting the very house I had built from the ground up. I was merely waiting for the inevitable, catastrophic hammer to slowly fall. Diane found me standing near the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of the main living room. She practically floated across the polished hardwood floor, wearing an incredibly lavish custom silk gown that radiated pure, toxic arrogance. Her neck was heavy with borrowed diamonds, and her eyes gleamed with a vicious, triumphant light. She had spent the last 2 decades desperately craving this exact level of social dominance, and she firmly believed she had finally achieved her ultimate victory. She stopped inches from my face, her perfume heavy and suffocating, ensuring no one else could hear the venom in her voice. "I really hope you are taking detailed notes, Victor," Diane whispered, her lips curling into a deeply malicious smile. "This is what true limitless success actually looks like. I spent years suffocating in your painfully boring conservative world. You were always so terrified of taking massive risks, so obsessed with saving pennies, while the real players were making billions. Look around you. I finally upgraded to a man who understands how to rule the world. You should feel incredibly honored that we even allowed you to stand in the shadows and witness the beginning of our magnificent new financial dynasty." I absorbed her cruel, deeply arrogant words without showing a single trace of emotion. I let my expression remain blank, playing the part of the completely outmatched, pathetic ex-husband. "You have certainly managed to secure a highly unique future for yourself, Diane," I replied quietly, keeping my tone perfectly subservient. "I sincerely hope this massive investment brings you exactly the kind of profound return you truly deserve." She laughed softly, a sharp, incredibly condescending sound, and proudly patted my shoulder. "Do not worry about us, Victor. Preston and I are completely untouchable now. We are moving light years ahead." She turned and glided back toward the massive patio, eager to continue holding court with her wealthy admirers. I remained standing by the towering glass windows, my hands resting calmly in my pockets. The lavish ceremony was scheduled to begin in less than an hour. The grand string quartet was already playing soft, elegant melodies, and the 500 guests were slowly beginning to take their designated seats on the manicured lawn. Preston was standing near the grand floral archway, aggressively checking his counterfeit watch for the fourth time in 10 minutes. His desperate countdown to Dubai was now accelerating. He wiped a bead of nervous sweat from his forehead, his charismatic smile looking increasingly strained and incredibly fragile. He was completely surrounded by his adoring wealthy victims, blissfully unaware that his massive $5 million escape hatch had already been securely welded shut by Mitchell's brilliant legal maneuvers. The massive shadow loan was frozen, the offshore accounts were flagged, and the dangerous underground syndicate was actively hunting for their missing collateral. I watched Preston scan the elegant crowd with terrified, paranoid eyes, searching for an exit strategy that no longer existed. The beautiful illusion was beginning to violently fracture. I shifted my gaze away from the sweating con artist and looked out through the pristine floor to ceiling glass windows, staring past the lavishly decorated patio and down the long, winding private driveway of the sprawling estate. The cheerful music from the string quartet seemed to fade into a distant, muffled hum. My pulse remained incredibly steady, my breathing slow and completely controlled. Emerging silently from the dense line of coastal trees, completely bypassing the private security gates, I noticed 3 massive, unmarked black SUVs smoothly and quietly pulling up to the outer perimeter of the beautiful grand property. I watched the 3 unmarked black SUVs idle silently at the edge of the sprawling estate, their dark-tinted windows reflecting the golden afternoon sun. They did not breach the inner perimeter. They simply sat there, massive and imposing, waiting patiently in the shadows, like a pack of wolves encircling a wounded deer. I knew exactly who was inside those vehicles, and I knew exactly why they had come. The underground syndicate had successfully tracked the fraudulent collateral, and they were here to collect their deeply encumbered $5 million. But they were not my immediate concern. I turned my back to the towering glass windows and walked away from the quiet observation point, seamlessly blending back into the bustling crowd of incredibly wealthy guests. The grand string quartet suddenly shifted their elegant melody, the swelling notes of a traditional bridal march, echoing across the pristine manicured lawns. It was time for the main theatrical performance to officially begin. I moved slowly toward the back of the massive seating area, purposefully selecting a solitary wooden chair in the very last row, completely obscured by a towering arrangement of imported white orchids. I did not want to disrupt their perfect visual aesthetic, and more importantly, I wanted a clear, unobstructed vantage point to witness every single second of their deeply pathetic, heavily manufactured charade. The 500 elite guests quickly took their assigned seats, the gentle rustle of expensive silk, and the soft murmur of hushed, expectant conversations, filling the crisp ocean air. I sat perfectly still, my hands resting calmly on my lap, my expression entirely unreadable. I was a ghost haunting my own past, a silent witness to a monumental catastrophe disguised as a fairy tale. Preston stood confidently at the grand floral archway, bathed in the warm, flattering light of the late afternoon sun. He looked the absolute picture of a highly successful, deeply fulfilled Wall Street titan. His bespoke tuxedo was immaculately tailored, completely hiding the terrified, desperate, cornered animal, sweating profusely underneath the expensive fabric. He clasped his hands together in a posture of quiet, humble reverence, playing the role of the devoted groom with sickening, practiced perfection. Standing proudly right next to him was my own son Derek, completely puffing his chest out as the designated best man. Derek beamed with an ignorant, arrogant pride, his eyes scanning the elite crowd of fake investors and shallow socialites, as if he had finally arrived at the very pinnacle of human achievement. He firmly believed he was cementing his rightful place in global high society, completely unaware that the luxurious clothes on his back, the imported champagne he had been eagerly drinking, and the massive estate beneath his feet were entirely funded by a sophisticated, incredibly dangerous web of stolen money and violent debt. I looked at Derek and felt a profound, heavy ache of ultimate parental failure. I had spent my entire life trying to teach him the fundamental difference between real sustainable value and cheap, hollow illusions. But he had willingly chosen the illusion, eagerly trading his moral compass for a front-row seat to a magnificent fraud. He was standing shoulder to shoulder with a notorious international con artist, proudly defending a man who was actively planning to abandon him to the federal authorities in a matter of hours. The sheer tragic comedy of his profound ignorance was almost physically painful to endure. The elegant music swelled to a dramatic crescendo, and Diane finally made her highly anticipated grand entrance. She glided slowly down the pristine white aisle runner, her extravagant designer gown trailing heavily behind her like a royal cape. Her face was illuminated by a radiant, deeply triumphant smile, her eyes locking onto Preston with absolute, unwavering adoration. She looked like a woman who had completely conquered the world, a queen claiming her ultimate, long-awaited prize. She believed she was firmly securing a limitless future of private jets, exotic offshore vacations, and unrivaled social dominance. She had absolutely no idea that she was happily walking straight into a catastrophic financial slaughterhouse, eagerly binding herself to a man who had secretly mortgaged her entire existence to ruthless criminals. As she reached the floral archway, Preston actually managed to produce a few glistening, entirely fake tears, wiping them away with a monogrammed silk handkerchief. It was a masterclass in sociopathic deception. The affluent crowd let out a collective soft sigh of romantic appreciation, completely fooled by the slick, rehearsed performance. The highly paid officiant began speaking, delivering a long, poetic monologue about trust, enduring partnership, and the beautiful merging of two incredibly successful lives. I sat in the very last row, surrounded by the overwhelming scent of thousands of blooming orchids, and listened to the hollow, meaningless vows with absolute, freezing coldness. Diane confidently looked into the cold, lying eyes of a dangerous predator and eagerly said, "I do." She was willingly marrying a complete ghost, a phantom who was currently scheduled to board a private charter plane to Dubai at exactly 11 tonight. She promised her life to a man who possessed absolutely nothing but a stolen watch, a hollow offshore shell corporation, and a massive mountain of incredibly toxic, violent debt. The lavish ceremony concluded with a dramatic, passionate kiss, sealing the ultimate fraudulent contract. The 500 elite guests immediately erupted into thunderous, enthusiastic applause, standing up to warmly cheer the newly married couple. Preston wrapped his arm tightly around her waist, raising his free hand to wave to the wealthy crowd, projecting the absolute pinnacle of fake manufactured joy. Derek stood right behind them, clapping loudly, his face flushed with unearned victory. I did not stand. I did not clap. I remained perfectly seated in the shadowy back row, a silent, unmoving statue, anchored deeply in reality, while everyone else floated aimlessly in a toxic bubble of profound delusion. I knew that every single perfect white flower, every imported crystal glass, and every drop of vintage wine waiting in the reception hall had been paid for by stolen laundered cash, violently extracted from vulnerable victims. The applause slowly died down, and the string quartet transitioned into an upbeat, lively tempo, signaling the official start of the grand celebration. The massive crowd began to slowly shift elegantly, making their way across the pristine lawns toward the sprawling, heavily decorated reception tent. Preston and Diane led the glamorous procession, smiling broadly for the hired photographers, completely blinded by their own glittering, shallow reflections. I waited until the seating area was nearly empty before I finally stood up from the wooden chair. I calmly smoothed out the slightly wrinkled lapels of my dated gray suit and very slowly turned my full attention away from the departing wedding party. I looked carefully past the towering, melting ice sculptures and the frantically rushing caterers, my cold eyes permanently locking onto the heavy swinging wooden doors of the busy kitchen service entrance. Emerging quietly from the chaotic, bustling shadows of the completely overwhelmed catering staff, I finally saw him. Mitchell stepped smoothly into the grand reception hall, his expression completely ruthless and intensely focused, securely carrying a sleek, heavy black briefcase holding their absolute destruction. Mitchell paused for a fraction of a second just inside the heavy, solid wooden doors, allowing his eyes to adjust to the blinding, opulent light of the grand reception hall. The room was a massive sea of swirling designer gowns, tailored tuxedos, and endless flowing champagne. Waiters rushed between the tightly packed tables, balancing towering silver trays loaded with decadent desserts and rare imported liquors. The air was thick with the suffocating scent of thousands of white orchids and the loud overlapping conversations of 500 incredibly wealthy guests who believed they were celebrating the union of the century. It was the absolute undisputed peak of high society arrogance, a glittering monument to Diane and Preston's shared toxic delusions. I remained seated in my shadowy, isolated corner in the very last row, keeping my eyes fixed entirely on Mitchell. He did not immediately rush the stage. He was a seasoned professional, a man who understood that a truly devastating execution required precise, unhurried timing. He stepped back against the heavily draped wall, melting into the dim perimeter of the extravagant room, tightly gripping the handle of his black leather briefcase. He was waiting for my final silent signal. A sudden, sharp chiming sound cut through the deafening roar of the crowded reception tent. Preston was standing at the absolute center of the elevated head table, confidently tapping a heavy silver spoon against the rim of his crystal champagne flute. The loud chatter slowly died down, replaced by an eager, respectful silence as all 500 guests turned their undivided attention toward the glowing groom. Preston smoothed the lapels of his custom tuxedo, puffing out his chest and flashing his brilliantly white, painfully artificial smile. He looked exactly like a man who had successfully conquered the entire financial universe, projecting an aura of absolute, unwavering invincibility. He picked up a silver microphone, gripping it with the practiced ease of a seasoned television evangelist, or a veteran con artist preparing to deliver his ultimate, masterfully crafted pitch. The lavish spotlight focused entirely on him, illuminating the fake Patek Philippe watch resting heavily on his left wrist. He waited until the massive room was completely silent, savoring the collective, undivided attention of his incredibly wealthy, deeply gullible audience. "Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed colleagues and cherished friends," Preston began, his voice booming smoothly through the high-end acoustic sound system. "Thank you all for traveling from every corner of the globe to join us in this magnificent mountain paradise. Today is not just a celebration of a beautiful romance. It is the official merging of two incredibly powerful dynasties. He paused dramatically, turning to look down at Diane. She was sitting right beside him, completely beaming with toxic pride, her diamond necklace practically blinding anyone who dared to look directly at her. Diane, my absolute queen, you are the missing piece to my massive global empire. You understand the profound weight of true ambition, and together we are going to completely redefine the boundaries of international wealth. The crowd let out a collective admiring sigh, entirely captivated by his smooth, poisonous charm. Preston raised his glass higher, his eyes scanning the front rows, where his most lucrative targets were seated. But a king is nothing without a strong, capable heir to help carry the heavy mantle of leadership into the next generation. That is why tonight is also an incredibly special professional milestone. I want to raise a very special toast to a brilliant young man who has proven he possesses the ruthless hunger and the sharp intellect required to dominate the modern financial markets. Preston turned his predatory gaze toward the other end of the head table. "Derek, please stand up," Preston commanded with jovial authority. My foolish, incredibly naive son eagerly pushed his chair back and stood up tall, straightening his bespoke midnight blue tuxedo jacket. He was practically vibrating with desperate, unearned pride, his face flushed with the intoxicating thrill of being publicly validated by a supposed Wall Street billionaire. "Ladies and gentlemen, I formally introduce to you my new son and the newly appointed Executive Vice President of Global Acquisitions for my primary hedge fund, Derek." The massive room immediately erupted into thunderous, enthusiastic applause. Wealthy investors clapped wildly, raising their expensive glasses to salute my son, completely unaware that they were cheering for a severely diluted pawn in a massive federal crime. As the loud applause washed over the elegant room, Derek slowly turned his head, his eyes scanning this massive sea of tables, until he finally found me sitting alone in the very back row. He looked directly at my worn leather shoes, my dated gray suit, and my quiet, unassuming posture. A slow, deeply condescending smirk spread across his face. He raised his crystal flute of champagne, pointing it directly at me in a mocking, utterly disrespectful, silent salute. He was telling me that he had won, that he had successfully discarded the pathetic, out-of-touch old man, and that he was now ascending to a superior plane of existence that I could never possibly comprehend. I did not react to his silent, vicious insult. I did not break eye contact. I simply swallowed the bitter taste of his profound betrayal, keeping my face completely frozen in a mask of total, unbothered calm. I let Derek enjoy his fleeting, hollow victory for exactly 10 more seconds. Then I slowly lowered my head and gave a single, almost imperceptible nod toward the dark perimeter of the crowded room. Mitchell caught the signal instantly. The seasoned corporate fixer pushed himself away from the heavily draped wall and stepped purposefully into the bright, blinding light of the main reception floor. He did not attempt to blend in with the cheerful, clapping crowd anymore. He walked with a heavy, terrifying, and utterly relentless forward momentum, his dark suit cutting a sharp, lethal contrast against the sea of pastel dresses and white floral arrangements. Two massive, highly trained private security guards stationed near the main aisle quickly stepped forward to intercept him, their hands instinctively reaching for their earpieces. Mitchell did not even break his rapid stride. He simply flashed a single, highly official federal document from his inner jacket pocket, completely freezing the two large guards in their tracks. They instantly stepped aside, their professional confidence evaporating into sudden, fearful confusion. Mitchell marched straight down the center aisle, moving with the unstoppable, crushing force of a freight train. His polished black shoes clicked rhythmically against the pristine hardwood floor, a sound that slowly began to penetrate the dying applause. He kept his cold, dead eyes locked squarely on the center of the elevated head table. Up on the grand stage, Preston was still smiling, still basking in the fading cheers of his wealthy victims, when his peripheral vision finally caught the rapid, aggressive movement in the center aisle. Preston slowly lowered his microphone, his charismatic expression freezing in place. He squinted against the bright spotlight, trying to process the incredibly jarring sight of a cold, unsmiling stranger marching directly toward his perfect, heavily guarded sanctuary. The magnificent, blinding illusion was about to be violently shattered into a million irreparable pieces. Preston stood completely paralyzed behind the towering arrangement of white orchids. His charming, perfectly practiced smile decayed into a rigid mask of absolute terror. He lowered the silver microphone slightly, his knuckles turning a stark, translucent white as he gripped the metal shaft. The entire reception hall, previously buzzing with the intoxicating energy of stolen wealth and unearned arrogance, plunged into an abrupt, suffocating silence. 500 elite guests sensed the sudden violent shift in the atmosphere. They watched in collective bewilderment as Mitchell, an unsmiling harbinger of absolute ruin, closed the remaining distance to the elevated head table. His polished shoes echoed against the hardwood floor, each step sounding like the heavy strike of an executioner's hammer. Derek immediately stepped forward, his chest puffed out in a pathetic display of misplaced loyalty. He raised a hand, attempting to intercept the man he believed was merely an aggressive wedding crasher. "Excuse me, my son," demanded his voice, cracking with a mixture of forced authority and underlying panic. "This is a highly exclusive private event. Security has already been notified. You need to turn around and walk out those doors right now." Mitchell did not even bother to look at my son. He simply kept walking, moving with the terrifying, unstoppable momentum of a natural disaster. He brushed past Derek as if the boy were nothing more than a minor gust of wind. Derek stumbled backward, his bespoke midnight blue tuxedo brushing against the pristine white tablecloth, his mouth opening and closing in mute, absolute shock. He had never encountered a man who completely ignored the illusion of power. Preston tried desperately to salvage the rapidly disintegrating situation. He raised the microphone back to his trembling lips, his voice tight and artificially loud. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated," Preston announced, forcing a nervous chuckle that echoed hollowly across the massive tent. "It appears we have a slight logistical misunderstanding. Our security team will handle this minor interruption immediately. We will return to the celebration in just a moment." But there was no security team coming to save him. The highly paid guards stationed at the perimeter had already seen the federal injunctions securely tucked inside Mitchell's breast pocket. They knew better than to interfere with a court-ordered mandate. Preston was entirely alone on that grand stage, stripped of his invisible armor, fully exposed to the cold, unforgiving light of reality. Mitchell finally reached the center of the head table. He stopped directly in front of Diane, placing the heavy black briefcase onto the pristine white silk tablecloth with a solid, definitive thud. The sound reverberated through the silent room, causing several guests in the front rows to flinch nervously. Diane stared up at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of indignation and sudden creeping dread. The emerald green designer gown she wore suddenly looked less like a garment of royalty and more like the uniform of a condemned prisoner. "Excuse me," Diane said, her voice trembling slightly as she tried to summon her usual haughty demeanor. "I do not know who you are, but you are completely ruining my reception. I demand that you leave this property immediately before I have you arrested for trespassing." Mitchell did not raise his voice. He did not shout, and he did not make any sudden aggressive movements. He simply leaned forward, resting both of his hands flat against the polished surface of the table. He leaned his head down, bringing his face mere inches from Diane's ear. His posture was almost intimate, a quiet exchange of profound, life-altering information. But in his calculated descent, he deliberately positioned his mouth directly beside the sensitive, highly amplified centerpiece microphone that Preston had foolishly left resting on the table stand. Mitchell's voice was a low, smooth, and utterly lethal baritone. The sophisticated acoustic system instantly captured every single syllable, broadcasting his private whisper to the farthest corners of the dead silent room. "It is over, Diane." Mitchell whispered the words, echoing like thunder through the massive speakers. "The SEC froze Preston Cyprus accounts an hour ago. The shadow lenders are at the front gate for their $5 million, and the FBI is at the back. Happy wedding day. The sheer absolute magnitude of those words hung in the crisp ocean air for a fraction of a second. The silence that followed was not merely the absence of noise. It was a physical, crushing weight that pressed down on the chests of everyone present. The 500 wealthy guests, the influential politicians, the elite institutional investors, all sat completely frozen in their designated seating areas. They processed the devastating revelation with absolute horror. The magnificent glittering illusion they had been eagerly celebrating just moments before instantly shattered entirely, replaced by the ugly, terrifying reality of a massive federal crime. I sat in my solitary wooden chair, in the very last row, completely hidden by the floral arrangements, and watched the utter destruction of their arrogant world. My pulse remained perfectly steady, my breathing slow and measured. The trap had sprung exactly as I had meticulously planned. The arrogant queen had been dethroned, the fake billionaire had been exposed, and my foolish son was standing on the wooden stage completely powerless to act anymore. Diane's face completely drained of all color. Her flawless, expensive makeup suddenly looked like a cruel, mocking mask painted onto a corpse. The triumphant, arrogant light in her eyes vanished entirely, replaced by a bottomless well of pure, unadulterated terror. She slowly lifted her trembling right hand, completely unable to process the catastrophic reality crashing down upon her. The delicate, imported crystal champagne flute she was holding, a glass that easily cost $200, slipped from her limp, entirely lifeless fingers. The fragile crystal fell in incredibly slow motion, tumbling down toward the pristine, highly polished marble stage floor. The sharp, explosive sound of the glass, shattering violently into 1,000 tiny, jagged pieces, echoed loudly through the silent tent. It was the perfect defining sound of her manufactured financial dynasty completely collapsing. The expensive vintage champagne splashed across the white silk tablecloth, looking exactly like a dark, spreading stain of guilt. Preston did not even bother to look at his beautiful, newly wedded bride. He did not attempt to comfort her, and he did not try to deny the devastating allegations. His sociopathic survival instinct instantly completely overrode any lingering pretense of humanity or true familial loyalty whatsoever. His artificially tanned face turned a sickly, translucent shade of gray. The charismatic, confident posture he had projected for months instantly evaporated, leaving behind nothing but a terrified, pathetic coward. He dropped the silver microphone onto the table. It hit the wood with a loud, piercing screech of audio feedback that made the guests cover their ears in pain. Without saying a single word, Preston frantically spun around and bolted aggressively toward the narrow side exit leading to the kitchen corridors. Derek stood completely frozen near the edge of the grand elevated stage, his mouth hanging open in absolute disbelief. The long, exhausting war was finally over, and justice had been served beautifully cold. I sipped my coffee quietly. Excellent. Preston did not even make it 5 steps toward the narrow service corridor before the heavy wooden doors violently burst open. He collided directly with a solid wall of dark windbreakers and tactical gear. At least a dozen federal agents flooded into the grand reception tent, their movements swift, highly coordinated, and utterly uncompromising. They fanned out across the marble floor, completely blocking every conceivable exit route with terrifying efficiency. The screeching audio feedback from the dropped microphone was instantly drowned out by the harsh, booming commands of federal law enforcement. The sheer velocity of the raid was staggering. Preston stumbled backward, his highly polished dress shoes slipping wildly on the spilled vintage champagne. He looked frantically to his left, attempting to pivot toward the manicured gardens, but another squad of armed agents was already rushing up the outer terrace steps. He was completely boxed in, a trapped rat finally facing the absolute end of his miserable, fraudulent maze. The 500 elite guests erupted into a deafening chorus of absolute panic and total chaos. Wealthy investment bankers and influential politicians practically trampled over each other, desperately scrambling to distance themselves from the radioactive epicenter of the unfolding raid. Expensive silk dresses caught on overturned chairs, and beautiful crystal centerpieces shattered violently against the marble floor as the massive crowd scattered like frightened insects. They were absolutely terrified of being photographed anywhere near a man who was actively being arrested by the federal government. Preston let out a desperate, completely animalistic shout and lunged blindly toward a narrow gap between two approaching agents. It was a completely pathetic, entirely futile attempt to escape the inevitable consequences of his massive crimes. A massive agent tackled him effortlessly, driving him forward with incredible crushing momentum. Preston was slammed violently against a towering, magnificent arrangement of white orchids and imported roses. The heavy wooden floral trellis collapsed immediately under his sudden weight, showering the pristine stage with crushed petals and stagnant water. The sickening thud of his face hitting the structural wood echoed sharply, followed instantly by the cold, definitive metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs locking securely around his wrists. The confident, brilliant Wall Street titan was instantly reduced to a sobbing, utterly disheveled criminal, physically pinned beneath a massive pile of ruined wedding flowers. Diane finally snapped out of her completely paralyzed, horrified trance. The blinding reality of her absolute total ruin crashed aggressively over her mind, completely shattering whatever fragile mental dam she had desperately constructed. She let out a piercing, genuinely hysterical scream that cut directly through the chaotic din of the deeply panicked crowd. She lunged forward, her arms flailing wildly as she sprinted frantically toward the federal agents pinning her fraudulent husband to the broken stage. She was completely unhinged, screaming, completely incoherent demands, aggressively ordering the heavily armed federal agents to unhand her billionaire husband immediately. She had spent the last 2 decades carefully cultivating a pristine image of flawless, untouchable grace, and now she was violently shedding it all in front of the most powerful social circle in the entire country. As she desperately scrambled over a fallen chair to reach the center of the chaotic fray, the heavy, extravagant train of her custom emerald gown caught sharply on a piece of jagged, exposed metal from the broken floral trellis. She did not stop running, driven completely by blind, hysterical panic. The incredibly expensive silk fabric tore with a loud, sickening rip, tearing violently straight up the side of her leg and destroying the beautiful dress entirely. Diane stumbled hard, falling forcefully to her knees amidst the scattered orchids, broken plates, and completely shattered glass. She remained there on the wet marble floor, weeping uncontrollably, her ruined designer dress soaking up dirty water and spilled champagne. The elite society she had so desperately sought to impress merely watched her total, utterly pathetic breakdown with cold, judgmental disgust, quickly raising their phones to record her ultimate, unforgivable humiliation. I watched the entire spectacular collapse unfold from the quiet, untouched safety of the back row, my face completely devoid of any sympathy, pity, or lingering regret. I sat perfectly still, an immovable grounded anchor amidst a raging, terrifying sea of screaming socialites and loudly shouting federal agents. The sheer magnitude of the aggressive destruction playing out on the grand stage was exactly what I had meticulously engineered over the past 48 hours. I had not merely dismantled a massive, highly sophisticated financial fraud. I had completely obliterated their deeply arrogant, incredibly toxic delusions of grandeur. Every single beautiful flower crushed underneath the tactical boots, every single drop of expensive wine spilled uselessly on the floor, and every horrified gasp from the fleeing crowd was the direct, undeniable consequence of their own blinding, insatiable greed. Diane had eagerly traded her soul for a fake, glittering crown, and now she was weeping bitterly in the absolute ruins of her imaginary, completely fraudulent kingdom. Mitchell stood calmly near the very edge of the broken stage, his arms casually crossed over his chest, watching the stern agents physically drag the sobbing Preston away toward the waiting vehicles. He looked entirely satisfied with his flawlessly executed handiwork. The dangerous, heavily armed shadowlenders waiting impatiently at the front gate would certainly be severely disappointed that the federal government had claimed their primary target first, but that specific issue was simply no longer my problem to worry about. I had successfully isolated the immediate threat, legally protected the remaining vulnerable assets, and delivered a level of pure, unadulterated justice that no standard slow-moving courtroom could ever possibly replicate or deliver. The grand illusion was dead. Suddenly, a frantic, highly erratic movement instantly caught my full attention in the busy center aisle. The frantically fleeing guests parted roughly as Derek violently shoved his way directly through the massive, panicked crowd, completely ignoring the strict commands of the federal agents securing the outer perimeter of the massive reception tent. My son looked absolutely devastated and completely terrified. His perfectly styled hair was plastered tightly to his sweating forehead, and his highly expensive bespoke midnight blue tuxedo jacket was visibly ripped at the shoulder seam. He was hyperventilating severely, drawing in incredibly shallow, rapid gasps of thin air, as if all the oxygen in the massive tent had simply vanished entirely. His eyes darted wildly across the room, completely filled with a raw, intense primal terror that had completely erased every single trace of his previous deeply insulting, arrogant swagger. He finally spotted me sitting calmly and quietly in the absolute back row, and sprinted frantically toward my isolated table, nearly tripping heavily over a discarded, dented silver catering tray. He slammed his shaking hands down aggressively on the solid wooden surface directly in front of me, his knuckles stark white, his chest heaving violently with absolute unchecked panic. He leaned in extremely close, his rapid breath heavily reeking of expensive vintage champagne and utter, absolutely crippling, undeniable terror. "Dad," he loudly gasped, his cracking voice a completely desperate, terribly pathetic, pleading wheeze. "Please just tell me about my entire trust fund. Tell me the $2 million wire went through before the freeze." I stared down at my trembling son, watching his desperate, terrified eyes frantically searching my face for any sign of comfort or salvation. Derek gripped the edge of the heavy wooden table so fiercely that his knuckles were entirely devoid of blood. His shallow, rapid breaths hitched in his throat, his chest heaving under the ruined, expensive fabric of his bespoke midnight blue tuxedo. The absolute, undeniable terror radiating from him was palpable, a stark, humiliating contrast to the arrogant, deeply condescending young executive who had mocked my worn leather shoes just a few short hours ago. He was no longer the incredibly proud, newly minted vice president of a global hedge fund. He was a frightened, foolish child who had blindly wandered into a highly lethal trap and was now desperately begging his father to pull him out of the fire. I did not reach out to comfort him. I did not place a reassuring hand on his trembling shoulder, and I certainly did not offer him the warm forgiveness he was seeking. Instead, I remained perfectly still, my expression frozen into a mask of unforgiving granite. I let the heavy, suffocating silence stretch out between us, allowing the chaotic sounds of the ruined reception hall to fill the incredibly tense space. The distant shouts of the armed federal agents dragging Preston away, the pathetic sobbing of Diane on the wet marble floor, and the frantic murmurs of the fleeing, terrified elite guests created a truly perfect symphony of total destruction. I wanted Derek to hear every single note of it. I wanted him to fully absorb the catastrophic environment he had so arrogantly embraced. "You want to know about your trust fund?" I finally said, my voice devoid of paternal affection, dropping into a dangerously calm timbre that sliced easily through his hyperventilating panic. "You want to know if the $2 million wire successfully transferred into the completely fraudulent offshore account of an international con artist." Derek nodded frantically, a single tear of pure terror spilling over his lower eyelid and sliding rapidly down his flushed cheek. "Yes," he choked out, his voice cracking pitifully. "Please, Dad, tell me the money is safe. Tell me I am not completely ruined." I looked him dead in the eye, stripping away the very last shred of his incredibly fragile, manufactured reality. "I canceled the wire transfer a week ago, Derek." I stated my words, falling like heavy leaden weights directly onto his chest. "I froze the account the very second I discovered the routing numbers Preston had given you. Your $2 million is entirely safe, securely sitting in a protected, highly encrypted holding trust that you will not have any direct access to for a very long time." A massive gasp of immense profound relief ripped violently through his throat, but I immediately raised my right hand, completely cutting off his desperate attempt to thank me. I saved your money, I continued, my tone growing even colder, thoroughly merciless in its precision. But I could not possibly save you from your own staggering, arrogant stupidity. Derek flinched violently, as if I had physically struck him across the face. He stared at me, his eyes wide and hollow. Do you have any actual comprehension of what you almost did today? I demanded quietly, leaning slightly forward to ensure every single syllable penetrated his thick, incredibly foolish skull. You willingly agreed to secretly wire $2 million of clean capital directly into a dark, commingled offshore account, controlled entirely by a violent underground lending syndicate. If that specific wire had actually gone through, your name would be permanently and undeniably linked to a massive international money laundering operation. You would not simply be completely broke right now, Derek. You would be a designated, incredibly convenient fall guy. You would be facing 20 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary for wire fraud and criminal conspiracy. His face completely drained of all remaining color, turning a sickly, translucent shade of chalky white. His legs began to tremble uncontrollably beneath him. You were so completely blinded by your desperate, pathetic hunger for unearned social status, I told him, stripping away the final layers of his enormous ego. You genuinely thought you had bypassed the hard, grueling work required to build a real career. You wanted to be a hotshot vice president for a glamorous Wall Street titan. You mocked my regional real estate portfolio. You mocked my shoes. You mocked the very foundation of honesty and grueling labor that actually paid for the incredibly expensive suit you are currently sweating in. Well, take a good hard look around you, son. This is your glamorous empire. Welcome to the real world. The incredibly harsh, completely undeniable truth crashed violently into his fragile mind. The profound realization of his own spectacular failure, the horrifying understanding of how close he had come to absolute permanent destruction, shattered his remaining physical strength. Derek let out a hollow, agonizing groan. His trembling knees finally buckled entirely beneath his weight, and he collapsed heavily onto the hard wooden floor right beside my table. He buried his sweating face deep into his hands, weeping with the loud, ugly, completely unrestrained sounds of a totally broken man whose entire identity had just been forcefully eradicated. I looked down at his shaking, pathetic form, feeling no joy in the brutal execution of my necessary parental duty. It was a harsh, terrible medicine, but it was the only possible cure for the toxic, entitled sickness that had deeply infected his mind. I had forcefully removed the blinding scales from his eyes, and now he would have to learn how to crawl through the harsh, unforgiving rubble of his own mistakes. I slowly shifted my cold gaze away from my sobbing son and looked back toward the center of the devastated reception hall. The armed federal agents had successfully secured the immediate perimeter, aggressively clearing the remaining stragglers and entirely securing the shattered stage where Diane was still kneeling in a pathetic, ruined pile of wet silk and crushed orchids. However, the federal authorities were not the only incredibly dangerous predators currently operating inside the sprawling Hamptons estate. The heavy, ornate wooden doors of the main entrance silently pushed open, bypassing the chaotic, overwhelmed federal checkpoint at the back of the massive property. Two incredibly large, deeply intimidating men stepped smoothly into the grand hall. They were not wearing tactical law enforcement windbreakers or holding official government badges. They were dressed in impeccably tailored dark charcoal suits that failed entirely to hide the incredibly thick, muscular bulk of their physical frames. They moved with a chilling, predatory grace, an ominous silence trailing closely behind in their heavy, measured steps. They completely ignored the shouting federal agents, the weeping guests, and the shattered crystal scattered across the floor. They walked with absolute terrifying purpose, stopping exactly at the edge of the ruined stage. The two Shadow Syndicate lenders simply stood there, their cold, completely dead eyes staring directly down at Diane, completely and utterly fixing their undivided, violent attention onto the frightened woman and the massive, luxurious property they now fully intended to violently seize. The two Shadow Syndicate lenders simply stood there, their cold, completely dead eyes staring directly down at Diane, fixing their undivided, violent attention onto the frightened woman and the luxurious property they now fully intended to violently seize. I watched the extremely grim tableau unfold for only a few short seconds. The heavy atmosphere inside the grand reception hall had shifted from chaotic panic to a dark, incredibly ominous tension. The federal agents were busy coordinating the immediate removal of Preston, dragging his defeated frame out through the kitchen corridors, completely oblivious to the silent, deeply dangerous men who had bypassed their rear perimeter. I had meticulously engineered this exact convergence of catastrophic consequences, and my physical presence was simply no longer required. I did not need to stay and watch the ruthless vultures pick the brittle bones of their shattered, fraudulent empire. I had delivered the crushing reality check they had so arrogantly demanded, and my hands were now entirely clean of their magnificent mess. I slowly reached up and calmly straightened the lapels of my dated gray suit, feeling a profound sense of absolute closure wash over my tired shoulders. I turned away from the devastating scene and began to walk purposefully toward the main exit. I stepped directly past my son. Derek was still crumpled on the hardwood floor, his face buried deep into his hands, his body shaking with violent sobs. He did not look up as my worn leather shoes clicked rhythmically past his trembling form. I did not pause to offer him a final comforting glance. He had made his choice, eagerly trading his moral foundation for a cheap illusion, and now he would have to independently navigate the harsh, unforgiving consequences of his stupidity. I continued walking down the center aisle, navigating the absolute wreckage of the extravagant celebration. Overturned chairs, shattered crystal centerpieces, and crushed imported white orchids littered the polished marble floor. I walked right past Diane. Her hysterical screams had dissolved into a series of ragged, terrified gasps as the two massive syndicate enforcers took a slow, deliberate step toward her. The beautiful, confident queen of high society was gone, replaced by a desperate, ruined woman kneeling in a puddle of spilled champagne and dirty water. The elite, wealthy guests who had eagerly toasted her success 20 minutes ago were now frantically scrambling toward the exits, entirely abandoning her to the violent predators she had foolishly invited into her home. The grand illusion of her flawless billionaire lifestyle was violently ripped away in front of 500 judgmental people, leaving her exposed to a terrifying permanent nightmare. I pushed through the heavy wooden doors and stepped out into the crisp, freezing winter air. The scene outside the grand tent was one of absolute pandemonium. Wealthy investment bankers and influential politicians were practically shoving each other out of the way, desperately fighting to reach the valet stand. Expensive sports cars and chauffeured limousines were aggressively honking their horns, creating a massive, gridlocked traffic jam in the sprawling cobblestone driveway. They were fleeing the toxic fallout of Preston's collapsed Ponzi scheme like terrified rats abandoning a rapidly sinking ship. I completely ignored the frantic shouting and the aggressive pushing, walking with a calm, unhurried pace down the long winding path away from the estate. My inconspicuous standard Blacktown car was waiting quietly near the outer stone gates, positioned far away from the chaotic traffic jam. The driver, a quiet professional whom Mitchell had personally vetted and secured for the evening, immediately stepped out and opened the rear door for me. I slid into the warm, comfortable leather seat, letting out a long, slow breath as the heavy door closed firmly behind me, silencing the frantic noise of the collapsing wedding reception. "Drive," I instructed quietly. The driver nodded smoothly, pulling the vehicle away from the luxurious property and merging onto the dark, winding coastal highway, heading straight toward the city. The smooth, quiet ride away from the Hamptons provided a beautiful contrast to the absolute devastation I had left behind. As the dark trees flashed past the tinted windows, the heavy silence inside the cabin was broken by a sharp, aggressive buzzing sound. I reached into the inner pocket of my suit jacket and pulled out my mobile phone. The bright screen was aggressively illuminating the dark interior of the car, vibrating violently in the palm of my hand. The caller identification displayed Diane's name in bold, frantic letters. I watched the screen flash repeatedly, imagining the unadulterated terror radiating from her current position. She was likely surrounded by aggressive federal agents, demanding immediate answers, and violent syndicate enforcers, demanding their missing $5 million. She was desperately reaching out to the only man who had ever truly protected her, entirely forgetting that she had proudly demanded I disappear from her family forever just 24 hours ago. I let the phone ring until the call finally dropped to voicemail. 5 seconds later, the device immediately started vibrating again. This time, the bright screen displayed Derek's name in large text. My terrified son was calling me profusely, weeping desperately, begging for me to return to the estate and magically fix the catastrophic legal and financial ruin he had so arrogantly walked into. He urgently wanted his strong, dependable father to shield him from the terrifying federal investigation and the massive public humiliation that was currently dominating the evening news cycle. He wanted the clueless old man to suddenly become his ultimate savior. I stared at the screen as the phone vibrated against my palm. As the car sped steadily toward the John F. Kennedy International Airport, notifications flooded my device. Dozens of missed calls, hundreds of frantic text messages, and countless desperate pleading voicemails completely overloaded my personal inbox. Diane was screaming for immediate financial assistance and elite security protection. Derek was crying for urgent legal representation and his fatherly guidance. They were entirely drowning in the deep, violent ocean of their own making, frantically grasping for a life raft that simply did not exist anymore. I read no messages and listened to zero voicemails. I tapped the power button, watching the screen fade to black, before slipping the silent phone into my pocket. The illuminated terminals of the airport appeared on the dark horizon, a beautiful beacon of permanent freedom. I instructed the driver to pull up to the private departure gate. I gathered my small travel bag and stepped into the busy crowd of midnight travelers. I walked smoothly through the security checkpoint, presenting my passport with a quiet smile. My private flight to Italy was already boarding. I was finally returning to my peaceful villa nestled in the green hills of Tuscany, a tranquil world completely untouched by their toxic greed. I handed my ticket to the flight attendant and walked down the jet bridge. I took my seat by the window, ordered a glass of red wine, and looked out at the dark city of New York one final time. I had perfectly executed my ultimate responsibility, and now I was going to let them completely stew in the terrifying, inescapable hell they had so arrogantly created. The golden morning sunlight washed over the rolling green hills of the Tuscan countryside, casting long, peaceful shadows across the stone terrace of my villa. 3 entire days had passed since my private jet touched down on the quiet Italian tarmac, carrying me far away from the catastrophic wreckage of the Hamptons. For 72 hours, I had existed in a state of absolute uninterrupted silence. I had purposefully left my mobile phone sealed inside the dark leather compartment of my travel bag, refusing to allow the toxic, frantic energy of their collapsing world to pollute my sanctuary. I spent my days walking through the ancient, meticulously manicured vineyards, feeling the rich, dry earth beneath my shoes, completely breathing in the crisp, clean air. It was a profound, deeply restorative isolation. The stark contrast between my serene, sunlit reality and the dark, terrifying nightmare they were currently enduring was absolute. I sat down at the small wrought iron table overlooking the vast, sweeping valley, listening to the gentle morning breeze rustle through the olive trees. A delicate porcelain cup rested on the glass surface, a thin wisp of steam rising slowly from the dark, rich espresso. I smoothed the lapels of my linen jacket, feeling entirely grounded, entirely at peace. The time for total silence had finally run its course. It was time to survey the definitive aftermath of the storm. I reached into my pocket, retrieved the sleek black device, and pressed my thumb against the power button. The screen glowed to life, illuminating the quiet morning air. Almost immediately, the device began to vibrate with violent, sustained intensity. A massive, completely overwhelming flood of delayed notifications crashed onto the screen in rapid succession. Hundreds of missed calls, countless urgent text messages, and a continuous stream of desperate voicemails piled up fighting for digital space. The phone practically hummed with the concentrated toxic desperation of two people who had finally realized they were drowning without a life raft. I did not even have the opportunity to open a single message before the screen abruptly cleared, replaced instantly by an incoming call interface. The name flashing across the digital display was Diane. She had clearly been dialing my number continuously, obsessively hitting redial for 3 solid days, waiting for a single connection. I watched her name flash, allowing the device to vibrate against the table for 5 long seconds. I savored the absolute power dynamic of the moment. I was no longer the discarded, out-of-touch old man sitting in the back row. I was the sole remaining authority in their shattered universe. I slowly reached out, swiped the green icon across the glass, and brought the receiver to my ear without speaking a single word. "Victor! Oh my God! Victor, please!" Diane shrieked the very second the connection was established. Her voice was completely unrecognizable. It was not the cold, polished, highly condescending tone of the arrogant society queen who had strutted through the reception hall wrapped in diamonds. It was a broken, frantic, utterly terrified wail of a severely desperate woman standing on the precipice of absolute destruction. The ragged, breathless quality of her words indicated she had not slept in days. "Victor, you have to help me, you have to listen to me," she begged, her words tumbling over each other in a chaotic, messy rush of pure panic. "It is a complete disaster. It is an absolute nightmare. You were right about him. You were right about everything, Victor. Preston is gone. He completely abandoned me. The moment the federal agents put him in the back of the transport vehicle, he started cooperating. He threw me under the bus, Victor. He told them the estate was technically in my name to shield his assets. He left me with everything." I listened to her hysterical, ragged breathing, keeping my expression perfectly neutral as I gazed out at the beautiful sunlit Italian valley. I did not offer a single syllable of comfort. I simply allowed the heavy, crushing weight of her massive mistakes to pour through the receiver, filling the quiet space around me with the pathetic sounds of her profound suffering. "The shadow lenders, the men in the suits," Diane gasped, her voice dropping into a terrified, trembling whisper. "They are foreclosing on the entire property. They showed up with fraudulent liens that Preston secretly attached to the estate. They are physically throwing me out, Victor. They said Preston owes them $5 million, and because we are legally married, the debt falls entirely on me. I have absolutely nothing. The federal government completely froze all the joint accounts the jewelry is being seized as evidence of wire fraud, and I am standing in the driveway with a single suitcase. They are taking the house, Victor. They are taking everything I have ever owned." Her desperate sobbing echoed sharply through the phone, a pathetic symphony of unadulterated misery. "But it is not just me, Victor," she cried, her voice cracking with a new, even sharper layer of absolute terror. "It is Derek. You have to save our son." The federal agents raided his new apartment yesterday morning. They are severely questioning him about the acquisition documents he blindly signed for Preston's hedge fund. They are treating him as an active, knowing co-conspirator in a massive international racketeering scheme. He is completely terrified, Victor. He is sitting in a federal holding room right now, crying, begging for a lawyer we cannot possibly afford to hire. You have to fly back here immediately. You have to call your legal team. You have to transfer the funds to pay off these terrifying men before they hurt me, and you have to get our son out of federal custody. Please, Victor, she wailed, her voice a raw, pathetic plea for unconditional salvation. I know I was wrong. I know I treated you terribly, but we are your family. We are your blood. You have always fixed things. You have always been the provider. Please, I am begging you on my hands and knees, save us from this hell. The line grew quiet save for her ragged, frantic hyperventilating. She was waiting for the familiar, comforting response she had spent decades taking entirely for granted. She expected the old Victor to drop everything, rush across the globe, open his massive checkbook, and shield her from the brutal, ugly consequences of her own blinding toxic greed. She expected the man she had so casually discarded to resurrect her ruined life and protect the foolish son she had actively encouraged to disrespect me. I let her desperate, broken silence stretch out for a long, agonizing moment. I slowly reached out with my free hand, my fingers wrapping smoothly around the delicate handle of the warm porcelain cup resting on the wrought iron table. I lifted the cup smoothly, the rich aroma of the dark espresso filling my senses as I took a small, deliberate, satisfying sip. The bitter, complex flavor grounded me perfectly in the reality of my quiet, untouchable sanctuary. I lowered the cup back down to the glass surface with a soft, definitive clink, preparing to deliver my final, absolute verdict. My voice was absolute ice when I finally broke the silence. You and your son told me I was a dinosaur, Diane. You looked me directly in the eye and told me I was a pathetic man completely without wealth or class. You both made it incredibly clear that I was nothing more than an embarrassing obstacle standing in the way of your brilliant new future. You told me the absolute best gift I could possibly give your family was to disappear permanently. Well, Diane, I am a man of my word. I heard a sharp, desperate gasp on the other end of the line, a sudden realization that the safety net she had always relied upon had been entirely removed. Victor. Please, she sobbed, completely abandoning any remaining shred of her pride. You cannot possibly leave us like this. They are going to take the house now. They are not taking the house to settle Preston's massive syndicate debts, corrected her calmly, leaning back in my comfortable chair. I am taking the house. I activated the $200,000 anonymous tax lien I purchased against the estate last month. Because you and your brilliant, wealthy husband were entirely too busy staging fake photo shoots and hosting lavish parties to actually pay the county property taxes the local government sold your debt. I bought it through a proxy holding corporation. As the primary lien holder on a severely defaulted property, my legal team initiated the immediate seizure protocols early this morning. The property will be formally seized by the county and publicly auctioned to satisfy the outstanding obligations. The men standing in your driveway right now are simply learning that they are entirely second in line. You have exactly 7 days to fully vacate the premises before the local sheriff physically removes you for trespassing. Victor, no, you cannot do this, Diane screamed, her voice tearing into a raw, ragged shriek of pure, unadulterated panic. Derek is facing federal prison. I have absolutely nothing left. We will be living on the street. You have to save us from this. You traded a life of quiet, genuine security for a cheap, glittering illusion. I told her, my tone completely devoid of any sympathy or lingering affection. You wanted the glamorous, ruthless reality of high society greed. Now you are finally experiencing exactly what that truly costs. I saved my own hard-earned wealth, Diane, but I absolutely refuse to save you from the profound, undeniable consequences of your own arrogant stupidity. Welcome to the real world. I did not wait for her to formulate another pathetic response. I pulled the phone away from my ear and firmly pressed the red button, completely severing the connection and cutting off her desperate, hysterical wailing forever. I opened the settings menu on my device and permanently blocked her number. I systematically scrolled down the contact list and blocked Derek's number as well. I erased their digital presence from my life with a few simple, entirely final swipes of my thumb. The device instantly fell perfectly silent, returning to its proper state of calm utility. I placed the black phone back onto the wrought iron table next to my empty espresso cup. I stood up and walked to the stone railing of my beautiful terrace. I looked out over the sweeping, magnificent hills of Tuscany as the golden afternoon sun began its slow, vibrant descent. The brilliant sky burned with striking shades of deep orange and rich purple, casting a warm, beautiful glow over the ancient, sprawling vineyards below. I breathed in the fragrant, incredibly pure evening air, slowly closing my tired eyes to completely savor the quiet, beautiful, and uninterrupted tranquility of the magnificent, glorious moment. I was finally completely free. I smiled softly, feeling a profound, absolute, and entirely ruthless peace settle permanently over my vindicated, fully restored, and peaceful soul. In this life, respect is the only currency that retains its value. Greed and arrogance will blind you to the quiet strength of the people who genuinely protected you. Never mistake a father's silence for ignorance, and never insult the foundation upon which your privileges were built. When you chase a glittering illusion, you will eventually be forced to pay with your reality. The truth is an absolute predator. It does not care about your ego, your designer clothes, or your societal status. It only cares about settling the final debt. Treat loyalty like a privilege or lose it forever. If this story of ultimate karma satisfied you, hit the like button and subscribe so you never miss another ruthless reality check. Drop a comment below right now. What would you have done to Derek and Diane? Let me know exactly where you are watching from today. See you soon.